In this lesson, we'll see how we can utilize the mental ray subsurface scattering skin specular shader. Now, this particular shader can be used to add specular components to certain subsurface shaders that normally don't have this type of capability. Perfect example for this would be the fast subsurface shader. So in our case, you can see we already have just a simple shader set up here. This is just using the fast shader. So if we take a quick render at what we have to begin with, you should see that we have no specular components applied to this. And once the render is complete, you'll see that that is exactly what we have. And again, this is just a limitation of using this particular subsurface shader. Now we can use the subsurface skin specular node as a way of adding specular capabilities to this type of shader. So all we have to do is drop this in, skin specular, and we'll take this and add this into the specular shader port of our fast shader node. And you'll notice immediately that now we start to have some kind of a specular highlight that shows up here in the viewport. So now let's compare what we have before and re-render. And now we can immediately start to see some highlights that begin to appear. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the attributes that are responsible for controlling the look of this specular result. So if we double click on the skin specular shader and start to expand some of these different tabs, you can see that the actual shader itself is fairly complex as far as the way that it allows us to simulate the look of our specular result. So this is actually simulating two different types of specular results. We have one that is a little bit more of a diffuse, sort of blurred out specular highlight, and then we have on top of that a second sharper specular highlight that's kind of right in here. So we do have completely independent control over the two of those. Right now, by default, the first layer of specularity is controlling this softer, blurrier specular result. So we can begin to increase its prominence if we start to increase the weight. So right now you can see that they are both set to fairly low values, but as we start to increase the weight closer and closer to 1, this now becomes much more prominent. We can also start to increase its edge weight, which basically controls how visible this specular result is as we get closer to the edges. So this will be a little bit easier to see if I were to take this and maybe start to drop this down a little bit more just so that it's a little bit easier to see. And let's render what we have right now. And this is what we get right now with an edge weight set up to a very high value. So anywhere along these edges, or in other words, any part of the geometry that's very heavily facing away from the camera, will start to receive these very strong specular highlights. Now if I save this for comparison and start to now bring my edge weight down to 0 and re-render, you can see now that our edge weight is now much less than what we had before. So that becomes especially apparent right back in these areas as well as up here. So this is with an edge weight of 0, this is with an edge weight of 1. Although you will notice that it really has no effect on these areas that are very closely oriented toward the camera. So again, that's kind of what the edge weight is able to do for us. Now below that we have the shininess. Now this is controlling the amount of blurriness that happens here. So with a lower amount of shininess, we get a softer specular result. You can see right now that this is already a pretty soft result to begin with. But as I start to lower this even more, you can see how that blurs out even further. Likewise, if I were to increase the shininess, you can see how this specular highlight starts to really tighten up and sharpen up. Alright, now below that we have our second layer of specularity, the exact same attributes that are responsible for this overall look, except now we're dealing with this sharper secondary specular highlight. If I increase the weight on this, again, you can see that start to become much more prominent. So really having these two layers of specularity can be really, really nice. So we have completely independent control over the color and the weighting of that as well. Now below that we have the reflections that we can start to add on here. So right now the reflective weight overall is non-existent, set to 0, so in other words we have no reflections. But if we were to start to increase this, let's say to a value of 0.5, and re-render, and you can see that once the render is complete that we do now start to get some fairly prominent reflections that start to appear in here. So right now this is controlling the reflect weight for areas that are more directly visible toward the camera. We can also have control over the reflect edge weight, same that we were able to control with the specular edge weight. So areas that are more indirectly facing the camera or pointing away from the camera will have very little shininess applied to them. Below this we have the reflect shininess. So right now this is controlling the blurriness of our reflections. And right now with this value set to something very, very low, we get very, very blurred reflections. If I were to start to increase this shininess, we should now start to get reflections that are a little bit sharper. And again, you can see that that's now exactly what we get. If you compare what we had before with these very soft, blurred reflections to what we have now, you can see there is a very significant difference. Alright, so that's a look at some of the very significant amount of control that we can get from using this fast subsurface specular node. And really, you'll find that these are the exact same attributes that you'll find whenever using the fast skin shader. So if when you go through that particular node, you will notice that we don't bother to cover the specular attributes of that particular fast skin shader, because again, they are identical to what you see here, just so that we can minimize the amount of redundant information presented from one lesson to the next. Right, so that's a look at how we can utilize this fast skin specular node.